Previously on LadyJenevia Reviews An Offer from a Gentleman in preparation for Bridgerton Season 4, I gave Asian Sophie Baek the nickname Sophie Baek. We had yet to get any confirmation from Netflix that Yerin Ha was playing her, even though the trades had already reported on that story, and we didn't have any promotional releases or set leaks, and oh, how the turns have tabled.
After the phone call, she was like, we gotta go home. I think I have indigestion. But yeah.
Hello romance girlies, I'm LadyJenevia, and on my channel I believe in Asian Sophie Baek. If you missed them, I also recently did videos about the official casting announcement Netflix did for not only Sophie but her stepfamily as well. And I also talked about the set photos for the masquerade ball. The back half of that video also forayed into broader season 4 opinions. It wasn't just a video of me discussing some of the pictures. We are also very close to hitting 30k subscribers at the time of me filming this video, so here is the shirt that Kimiko will be wearing in the next Bridgerton Season 4 video. Today's video is brought to you by my patrons who get access to exclusive videos not published here on YouTube. This summer, I did a review of one of the worst films I've seen this year, and access to that video has now rolled out to the $5 Cool Writers tier. But all paid patrons get access to the preview version of Patreon exclusive videos immediately, as well as early clips of non-time sensitive or non-embargoed video projects like this video that you're watching right now. Now, today's video is going to jumpstart an ongoing series in which I will be much more thorough in going through An Offer from a Gentleman, which is the source material for Bridgerton Season 4. But before I do that, I want to vaguely plug one of the movie reviews I'm going to be doing this month. I cannot say too much about that because I've been asked to wait to post my review until the week of release, but I will simply say that if you are a fan of fabulous Mexican actresses who are horror icons, then I will simply tell you to stay tuned. Now let's get into character, romance girlies.
Caterpillars, my precious caterpillars. In 20 minutes, you'll all be beautiful butterflies.
In today's video, we're going to go through the prologue and chapter 1 of An Offer from a Gentleman. I know that I gave a plot overview in my other video about this book, but this series is going to go into far more detail because we have 2 years to fill until season 4 is released. It's going to be this and a bunch of Avatar videos having a recurring presence on here because James Cameron is a romance girly, as am I.
Your heartbeat is fast.
Sorry.
Try to focus.
The prologue of An Offer from a Gentleman provides a crash course on Sophie's origin story. Everything you need to know about her lineage, her birth father, Richard, her stepfamily, and the circumstances that led to her being treated like a servant in this household. Let's do a quick recap of book prologues versus the adaptations thus far on the Netflix series. Season 1 was an adaptation of Book 1, The Duke and I. The prologue of that book gave a recap of Simon's backstory, of his stutter, being rejected by his father, and we saw that material in season 1 presented through the use of flashback scenes. This material was important to better inform the audience of why Simon is dragging his feet about fully throwing himself into his own love story with Daphne, and why he's so determined to spite his father by not having children and not passing on the title as a result. Season 2 was an adaptation of Book 2, The Viscount Who Loved Me. The prologue of that book was Anthony learning that his father had died from a bee sting. Some details were altered in the adaptation process. On the show, Anthony witnesses the death firsthand, but in the book, he comes home and Daphne informs him what happened. But nonetheless, the essence of what this material brings to him as a character, and by extension, the central love story of that season, was essential. Season 3 was an adaptation of Book 4, Romancing Mr. Bridgerton. The prologue of this book shared Colin and Penelope's meet cute, and they never actually showed us that meet cute on the show, and I will maintain a grudge over that because I always want to see the meet cute. Don't just exposition dump the first time they met by way of a conversation. Filmmaking is a visual medium, so show me their meet cute.
Well, this was some meet cute.
The book prologue also rehashes the "and I'm certainly not going to marry Penelope Featherington" debacle, which in the book you first read in Benedict's book, which is book 3, and it happens from the Bridgerton point of view. You are reading that scene from Benedict's perspective, but but in the book 4 prologue, you experience the exact same scene, this time from Penelope's perspective. On the show, they have a worse, more devastating and needlessly melodramatic version of that debacle in the season 2 finale. So, at least in regards to the essence of this exchange and creating some sort of rift that can shift the overall relationship dynamic in a way that's necessary to push that couple towards their endgame, it was presented in live action.
Nah, yo, hold my poodle. Hold my poodle. Hey, yo, what's up? Y'all got a problem?
Sophie's backstory is essential to understanding her as a person and why she has the reservations she does about fully throwing herself into her love story with Benedict. If you reflect on the way Simon had unresolved, unaddressed childhood trauma that was affecting his behavior with Daphne, Sophie is going to have the same thing with Benedict. Both of these love stories have their own identities, of course, but in a broad sense, those concepts have some overlap for the non-Bridgerton romantic leads of those stories. The Benioff book is called An Offer from a Gentleman, and you cannot understand why Sophie is rejecting Benedict's offer if you don't have this backstory. I've spoken more than once on my channel about how season 2, taking away Katani's backstory, was a total disservice to the character. Not to mention, the show ended up putting itself into an ocean of hot lava for taking away so much material from the Sharma family, the family of one of the 2 main characters of that season. So, if they don't give Sophie Baek her Baek story, that's going to be 2 Asian women you have treated as secondary in their seasons. And to be honest, you don't actually necessarily have to take too much time to present Sophie Baek's Baek story to contextualize her origins to the audience. Because the Benioff story is a reimagined Cinderella story, that archetype is incredibly familiar to the audience. Provide the main points of the backstory, and the audience will be able to fill in the rest of the gaps with how Sophie is treated by her stepfamily in the present day, and the ways that she holds herself back in her relationship with Benedict. Now, every season of Bridgerton has begun with a cheerful, upbeat, welcome back to the Tawn type of feeling, so I don't need the backstory to be the first thing you see in the way that it plays out in the book. The book prologues have never been the season openers. Oftentimes, Cinderella stories have done the backstory first, but typically those are being delivered in feature films. With an 8-episode streaming series, I see no issue with doing a welcome back to the Tawn opening, and then you can do flashbacks to Sophie's childhood either midway through episode 1 or perhaps some of that could go at the beginning of episode 2. Antony's flashback was at the beginning of season 2, episode 3. However, the audience was already familiar with Antony because they had followed him through season 1, where he had a more prominent B plot as well as his own entanglement with the A plot of the Daphne-Simon love story, because he was meddling with Daphne's attempts to find a husband because he's the family patriarch, and he was also friends with Simon long before Simon ever met Daphne. But for Sophie, this is the first time the majority of the audience will meet her. Most of the people who watch that season are not going to have read the book. When I do my polls about various things to do with Bridgerton, I can presume that many of the people who vote in those are more than just casual fans of the show, and yet somewhere around half of those people, give or take, often vote that they haven't read the book, if that poll is asking a question based on knowledge of the source material. So you have to make the story on the show work for the majority of the audience who will have not read the book before watching that story.
We're a book club. I know that. How stupid do you think I am?
Now let's go through the prologue in more detail. The first line reads, "Everyone knew that Sophie Beckett was a bastard." Strong opening, I know. It goes on to explain how Sophie was dropped off at Penwood Park, the place where she now lives, when she was only 3 years old with a letter in her pocket. Richard Gunningworth, Sophie's father, who is an earl, was the only one to read this letter, after which he burned it. Now everyone knows that Sophie is his daughter because genetics. Her features resemble both him and his mother, whom we never actually meet in the story, but her dress and gloves are what Sophie ends up wearing to the masquerade ball. The servants love Sophie and just maintain the cover story, which is that she's the orphan daughter of an old friend of Richard. Richard calls Sophie Sophia, and she calls him my lord. Initially, Sophie doesn't see him very often, only a couple of times a year. I don't know why he's not around more. He's probably too busy being a parasitic landlord and perhaps impregnating other women who are unfortunate enough to believe whatever pretty lies he said to convince them he was worth hooking up with in the first place. This is a safe space for Richard Gunningworth antis, and we shall not be apologizing for that.
Fuck you!
Now do keep in mind for the show that his name will be changed from Gunningworth to Gunn. We know that from the casting announcement for Sophie's stepfamily, which revealed that her stepmother would be having the surname Gunn instead of Gunningworth.
My name is Gia Gunn. I don't jump guns. I am the boom boom gun.
Sophie doesn't have many memories from before she came to Penwood Park, but she does remember a long coach journey with her grandmother on her mother's side, who isn't really described in much detail apart from her being sick. She's coughing and wheezing, as well as looking terribly thin. So the implication from this is that she's falling ill and needs to get Sophie somewhere where she will be looked after. Sophie also knows that she's a bastard, and no one has outright told her this initially, but she's no fool. She's a woman in STEM.
Before she meets Benedict and kind of after.
What does prismatic mean?
It's like, you know, like the properties of
Of a prism, like that's
when
really
the light
weird.
comes
When the
in
light
and then
comes
it
in.
like goes into a rainbow.
That's really, really beautiful.
So I'm gonna say that as a metaphor.
I am so powerful. My mind, it amazes me sometimes.
Now, I need to see Sophie's father, because for as much emphasis the story places on the villainy of Sophie's wicked stepmother and the mean stepsister, remember that Posey is the nicer stepsister, that's more so only the case because they are still alive and thus they are able to continue being awful to her. But the genesis of Sophie's trauma is her father. He knew she was being mistreated and did absolutely nothing to stop that. And he also never outright accepted her as his daughter. He made her feel ashamed and rejected as a child. And anyone with even the most basic understanding of developmental psychology will tell you that being treated in that way during that critical stage in her development will have a lasting impact on her. And we observe this to be true throughout the story. Fast forward 7 years and Richard, aka Dick, is going to start spending more time at Penwood Park because he's going to be marrying a woman with 2 daughters. Sophie is about 10 years old when she learns of this, and she's looking forward to it because she's hoping that she'll actually be able to get to know her father, build more of a connection to him, and most important of all, be part of a family. And when they all arrive at Penwood Park, it's Richard, Araminta, Rosamond, and Posey, we get this tidbit that absolutely shattered me. Sophie's breath caught in her throat as she waited for the new countess to emerge. Her little fingers crossed and a single "please" whispered over her lips. Please let her love me. Maybe if the countess loved her, then the earl would love her as well. And maybe, even if he didn't actually call her daughter, he'd treat her as one, and they'd be a family, truly. Did I start crying when I read this for the first time? Yes, I did, because I was devastated knowing 2 things. 1, these people are going to be evil to this little girl. And 2, eventually she's going to become part of the Bridgerton family, which, from everything I saw in seasons 1 and 2, is a loving family that does fun things like pall-mall and long conversations on swings and playful family bickering and banter.
I take it the 2 of you? No?
Do not look at me.
Have you ever visited a farm?
And I wanted little baby Sophie to have all of that because she deserves to be happy. I hadn't even finished the book at this point, or even finished the prologue, but I knew these things to be true because these stories are not whodunits. There's no mystery for the audience to try to solve. We know what the final destination is, and if I have my way, Araminta and Richard are boarding a one-way ticket to hell on Flight 180. Poor Sophie doesn't know what to do when everyone comes home because all of the household staff are being introduced, but Sophie doesn't have a clear designated place to be. She knows he's her father. He knows she's his daughter. The entire staff knows what this situation really is, but no one is allowed to speak it out loud. So once Sophie finally musters the courage to call out to Richard, he introduces her as his ward. But once Araminta gets a good look at her, the family resemblance is evident, and she immediately has an attitude. And Rosamond follows her evil mother's example.
And look, there they are. The Fen twins.
Poor little baby Sophie is still hopeful that things will be good. She's looking forward to having sisters or a family, but it doesn't take long for us to learn that this is the beginning of the worst period of Sophie's life. A period which will last for years. Sophie is having her lessons, and Araminta arrives with Rosamond and Posey and asks the teacher to show her daughters around the house and garden and declares that she's going to talk to Sophie alone. Araminta launches into the first of many incidents of being verbally and physically abusive to Sophie. She also outright refers to Sophie as a bastard, and this is the first time anyone has said that to her. I normally read book excerpts out loud to make my point, but I just don't have it in me to perform this part of the story for a video. It's deeply distressing and disturbing how Sophie is treated, and even more so because Sophie is a child at this point. Now, I remain steadfast in my stance that we need to see flashbacks to explain Sophie Baek's background, because it directly informs us of who she is and why she navigates her relationship with Benedict the way she does. Her trauma from her upbringing has shaped everything about her values, as well as how she reacts to things. That being said, I don't love the idea of showing, filming, or framing things in a way that would be overly distressing to a child performer. If they are going to do flashbacks, I'm assuming they will be fairly short, because I don't think you need to show a lot of this to make the necessary points to the audience that they will need to fully understand Sophie. But just as an example, if you want to show Sophie being spoken negatively to by Araminta while she's a child, you can just film that in a way where you film Araminta yelling, and you don't even need to have the child actor standing there actually being yelled at. Honestly, if you're pressed for time because corporate is overrun with clowns who think 8 episodes is sufficient enough for 1 season of Bridgerton, you could just film a close-up of Araminta glaring when she sees baby Sophie for the first time, and then cut back to present day where Araminta is being vile to present day Sophie, and the audience will be able to put 2 and 2 together. They will understand that this mistreatment has been going on for years. And by the way, speaking of episode count, Netflix randomly put this Colombian telenovela on my feed, and the description said something like, "A woman seeks to get revenge on a powerful man who murdered her mother." And I went, ooh, wait just a moment, I love to watch a woman on a righteous vengeance quest. That's giving me Manon de Sors vibes. I clicked on the thing to show me more information about what this was, and then it revealed that this show is 56 episodes long, and I went, no way. And this wasn't multiple seasons all added up to a grand total of 56 episodes. This was 1 season, 1 long story, an epic voyage of 56 episodes. And I had this morbid curiosity because I had never heard of such a thing. I watched 1 episode and went, oh yeah, no, I'm going to need to watch more of this. As it turns out, Latins are very good at getting me invested in drama, because I eventually finished the whole thing. Now, it didn't actually need to be 56 episodes, and they would do this thing where they would constantly replay scenes that we had already seen in past episodes, just to overly explain what a character is thinking about or remembering, or just to be overly thorough in explaining things to the audience. So this probably could have been cut down to, oh, I don't know, 45 episodes instead. But still, what a trip to watch something and feel like every character and storyline actually was given enough time to get from point A to point B and be properly explored and developed along the way. Anyway, it's called Le Venganza d'Analia if you want to watch it, and yes, the Pablo-Analia romance had me giggling and kicking my feet.
Mi mamá se lastimaría. ¿Cómo te voy a lastimar si te amo?
¿Cómo? ¿Qué fue lo que dijiste?
Imagine reconnecting with your childhood love, and you start to fall in love with him all over again. But he doesn't know you're his childhood love, because you had to go into hiding and change your name, because the man who murdered your mother tried to get rid of you by making a car go boom boom pow, and you feel like you can't tell the man you love who you really are, because you're just very busy with your vengeance quest that you've been working towards for decades. I mean, spoiler alert, she does eventually tell him who she really is, and it was so satisfying when we finally got there.
You okay?
Oh my god. I know I just went on this whole other tangent, but it is very difficult for me to get through the prologue of this book because of how distressing it gets for Sophie when she's just a baby.
She's a child!
And I wanted to take a detour to something fun. And to me, fun is watching Analia Guerrero and Pablo de la Torre fall in love twice. Anyway, here's an excerpt from the book that perfectly explains what Sophie's life is like before she gets her happily ever after by marrying into the Bridgerton family. Rosamund and Posey took their cues from Araminta and treated Sophie with hostility and disdain, although Posey's heart clearly wasn't into torture and cruelty in the way Rosamund's was. Rosamund liked nothing better than to pinch and twist the skin on the back of Sophie's hand when Miss Timmins wasn't looking. Sophie never said anything. She rather doubted that Miss Timmins would have the courage to reprimand Rosamund, who would surely run to Araminta with a false tale. And if anyone noticed that Sophie's hands were perpetually black and blue, no one ever said so. Posey showed her the occasional kindness, although more often than not she just sighed and said, "My mummy says I'm not to be nice to you." As for the Earl, he never intervened. So to anyone that is mad at the notion of Sophie's stepsister trying to go after Benedict because you don't want sisters to be pitted against one another, read the book. Rosamund is a villain just like Araminta, and that's why they don't get happy endings, nor do we want them to. That's not how this works. Bridgerton really needs to stop trying to redeem everyone on this show. It's insufferable to watch. Imagine if everything you watched was overly obsessed with trying to redeem every character when they don't deserve it. It does a disservice to the story. Imagine if you watched 10 Things I Hate About You, and they were all, ooh, but Joey's parents were mean to him sometimes, so we should feel bad for him. No! We want to see Bianca deck him in the nose so he gets all, I'm shooting a nose spray ad tomorrow.
Shit, Bianca, I'm shooting a nose spray ad tomorrow.
That's part of the catharsis for the audience. You watch someone be cruel to the characters that you're actually invested in, and then the people who are dishing out cruelty receive a slice of karma that is directly proportionate to their misdeeds. No forgiveness for Portia or Cressida. They went low, and I will get lower. I will be the entirety of Lil Jon and the East Side Boys the more that you try to push redemption onto bullies and abusers. Stop it. And speaking of karma, Richard dies at the ripe age of 40, just collapses in the rose garden. Bye, pumpkin! Bye, pumpkin!
Bye, pumpkin. Bye, pumpkin.
And the Earl doesn't have an heir. Araminta tries to pull a, but what if I'm pregnant? But she's not, so that doesn't last long. The will is read, and among the various things listed are funds left to give dowries to Rosamund, Posey, and Sophie. I know! I am all astonishment.
I am all astonishment.
As for Araminta, she is left a yearly income of £2,000, which I'm not really sure what that amounts to, because even if you were to do a conversion rate of pounds from this time period to pounds in 2024, I don't know what the various components of the cost of living are during this time period, but regardless, Araminta is displeased with this. However, there is an asterisk attached to this amount. If Araminta agrees to shelter and care for my ward, Miss Sophia Maria Beckett, until the latter reaches the age of 20, Araminta's annual income will be tripled to £6,000. Araminta wants the money more than she wants to kick Sophie out, so she decides to keep Sophie around, but the solicitor isn't the one to tell Sophie about the will. Araminta declares that she will tell Sophie herself. Now, a bit of important context to these events. Sophie is not present for the will reading. It's only the solicitor, Araminta, and the new Earl who has inherited the title because it's that classic English sexism.
I'm British. We only show affection to dogs and horses.
The new Earl is only described as a rather dissolute young man who was more often drunk than not.
This is a white.
Sophie doesn't know that she was left a dowry. She's going to find out much, much further into the story, but I just want to contextualize this now, since we are going to be gradually making our way through this story, and I would rather avoid any needless confusion about the material if I can foresee it potentially being confusing. I don't mind if the backstory gets downsized, or perhaps consolidated would be the more appropriate word, but a fair bit of this information needs to be conveyed in one form or another at some point in the season. I disagree with the choice to not show Pollen's meet cute when their love story was the A-plot of that season, but I can understand why people who don't understand how iconic meet cutes are to romantic stories,
You know. Morons.
would believe that they're dealing with a time crunch, so let's just scrap that. But we're on Sophie's season now, and we don't have seasons of introduction and backstory for her. She is new to the general audience, so we are going to need a proper introduction.
Indeed, without so much as an introduction.
But now let's go through chapter 1. I don't have as many strong opinions about chapter 1 as I do the prologue, because the whole topic of backstory and better material for the Asian lead of the season, it demands a lot of coverage on my part because of how poorly Katani was treated in that regard in her own season. The Pan-Asian Coalition has been slighted once already and will not be bestowing the benefit of the doubt if you do it twice. Chapter 1 opens with a Lady Whistledown newsletter talking about the upcoming Bridgerton Masquerade Ball. She places emphasis on Benedict and Colin as two of the prime catches of the season, as they are men with respectable fortunes, as well as the quote-unquote Bridgerton good looks. Yeah. Real subtle there, Penelope. Try to make it more obvious about who you're secretly in love with. The year at this point is 1815, and Sophie is being screamed at.
Juliet! Juliet! Juliet!
Rosamund and is demanding hot tea, fresh biscuits, and Sophie thinks about how she's always being overrun with various orders to complete a multitude of chores, fetching tea, mending, pressing, hairdressing, shoe polishing, because Miss Sophie is in full-on maid mode. She's wearing old maiden shoes.
They were old maiden type of shoes.
But just you wait, dear viewer, because this season, Miss Sophie Baek will be getting an upgrade on her shoes, her so-called family, and her entire life. Posey asks Sophie for her input on Posey's mermaid costume for the masquerade ball. Posey is complimentary about Sophie's fashion sense and laments how hard Araminta has been pushing her daughters about this masquerade ball. They need to look their best, and at least one of them needs to snare one of the eligible Bridgerton brothers. Gregory is 14 in this story, so he is not in the marriage mart yet. I do wonder when the show is going to launch Gregory and Hyacinth, though, into society. Perhaps it will be season 5 if we can get an official renewal. I mostly just want to reach a point of them being able to attend the balls so that we can get more of the Bridgerton family banter at those events. Posey laments how Lady Whistledown talking about the Bridgerton brothers as being eligible and desirable only makes Araminta more determined to nab one. Sophie asks about the newest Lady Whistledown edition because she hasn't had a chance to read it yet. And this is when we get the tidbit of Beck's story about how Sophie has been reading Lady Whistledown since it first launched 2 years prior. It's described as follows. Reading Whistledown was really Sophie's one true enjoyable pastime. Sophie has already read all the novels in the library, and none of the other 3 ladies of the household are interested in reading, so there would be no reason for any new books to be brought into the house. And Sophie, as someone being forced to work as a household servant, isn't permitted to go out and get new books. She's also not allowed to attend balls, so Lady Whistledown is her way of being able to feel as though she's a part of that high society world in all its glorious frivolity.
In hopes of distracting themselves from the pathetic emptiness of their meaningless
consumer-driven lives.
She reflects on how she would have liked to attend a ball, and it's something she might have been able to do if Richard had married Sophie's mother, but she still manages to muster up some gratitude in her mind about at least having the good fortune to have a home to live in, because other bastards might not even have that. Sophie is too good of a person. Truly, her heart is too gracious.
You having an unnatural allegiance to losers is not like you.
I'm glad that I'm fresh off of La Venganza de Analia binge, because right now, when I think about how Sophie has every right to unleash a vengeance quest on Araminta, I can just sit back and think about how I watched 56 episodes of Vengeance in Espanol and how delicious that was, and it just helps to soothe my nerves.
Girls, would you tell our nerves in tight places?
Sophie's internal thoughts reveal that she is aware of the fact that Araminta receives more money for keeping Sophie in the house until Sophie turns 20, but Sophie is not aware that she was left a dowry. Sophie is no longer able to wear the fine clothes that she had when her dirtbag father was alive. And she has to dress and eat the same way all of the maids do. And what do they eat? Whatever the 3 women of the household choose to leave behind. Let me tell you something. I am not Korean, but I have had this specific point explained to me by a Korean. Koreans are big on their food. Food has a massive presence in Korean culture. If they don't put Korean food somewhere into this season, even if it's just a dish or a side dish, I am going to know that you did zero consultation with actual Koreans. You better let Miss Yerin have a cargo ship full of input to infuse those cultural details if you do not already have them infused into the scripts. Remember how in season 2 they had the Indian tea, the hair oil, and the haldi? Yeah, we need those types of details. And remember that I am a more is more viewer, so there is no such thing as putting in too many Korean cultural references. Just put all of them in there. And you know what you could do? Let Sophie cook her own food while she's stuck doing maid things under Araminta's orders, and make it Korean food. Have any of you seen La Passion de Dodin Buffon? Give me shots like those, but of Sophie Baek making Korean food. Remember that it's noteworthy that Sophie's stepfamily are not Korean. As far as I can tell, they have Chinese names, so it would be Sophie's way of still being able to maintain her authentic self when she's being mistreated and suppressed. Maybe Mrs. Gibbons could also be Korean, so someone would be around to teach her to make more of those Korean dishes when she's growing up. Can we we please have that? Then, when Sophie works at the Bridgertons, she could make her favorite Korean dish and share it with Benedict. Let me see it. My eyeballs demand it. All my fellow Asians watching this, we know that food is the ultimate love language. Like when your parents give you sliced fruit, that part. But back to chapter 1. Posey asks Sophie to press her dress and do something to her shoes to make sure that there's no dirt on them. And then we fast forward a couple of days. Sophie is doing alterations on Araminta's Queen Elizabeth masquerade costume. Araminta is stressing about the ball and about Rosamond needing to secure a good match of marrying into money. Rosamond's costume is Marie Antoinette. And oh, that's perfect. I will come in a matching costume. I will be dressed as a guillotine.
Hurrah! Justice is served.
After Sophie leaves Araminta's room, Rosamond demands that Sophie fix a tear at the hem of her costume. Then Posey asks Sophie if she can do her hair because she found some green ribbons that she thinks can be styled to look like seaweed. And you know what? I respect the commitment to the bit. It's giving me Heidi Klum as a worm.
I feel very claustrophobic. How did you even get here, honey? I don't know.
Araminta pops back out of her room to yell at Sophie some more and compliment Rosamond and be mean to Posey, but not as mean to Posey as she is to Sophie. Sophie feels bad that Posey looks really obviously sad over not being complimented by her mother the way that Rosamond is, so Sophie compliments Posey. And how does Posey repay this kind gesture? Posey giggles when Araminta and Rosamond are maliciously laughing at Sophie for admitting out loud that she wishes she could also go to the ball.
Excuse me, what is your problem?
If you are new here and you're unfamiliar with the story, I will remind you once again. Posey is meant to be the nicer stepsister, and she will eventually get the redemption arc, but that doesn't mean that I need to be nice to her right now, when at this point in the story, the redemption moment has not arrived. So, these women are being nasty to Sophie about Sophie daring to admit her desire to go to the ball, despite knowing that she will not be able to go. But then, Mrs. Gibbons, the housekeeper, whom Sophie has known since she was a child, she's standing in the doorway, observing this entire kerfuffle about Sophie not being able to go to the ball, and she winks at Sophie. And Sophie finds this peculiar because she's never seen Mrs. Gibbons wink before. Wink at you? Why should I wink at my own child?
Wink at you? Why should I wink at you, child? What a notion. Why should I be winking at my own daughter, pray?
Fast forward 3 hours, and Sophie watches Araminta, Rosamond, and Posey get into the carriage and head off to attend the masquerade ball. Sophie is looking forward to having the night off, since without these women there won't be anyone to give her a bunch of chores to do. But she barely has a moment to decide how she will spend this evening when Mrs. Gibbons pops out and goes full Whitney Houston mode, because there is no time to waste, Sophie. We need to get you ready for the masquerade. And mind you, all these people in the house had been scheming because they already had a hot bath ready for Sophie. Do you know how long it takes to prepare a hot bath in the early 1800s in England? Mucho time. That's how long. But they somehow get her ready in an hour, which is the most difficult part of the story to believe. They also have an old trunk holding dresses that belonged to Sophie's grandmother on her father's side. At the very bottom of the trunk, they'd found an exquisite creation of shimmering silver with a tight pearl-encrusted bodice and the flared skirts that had been so popular during the previous century. Sophie felt like a princess just touching it. They also find matching gloves that are long and elbow length with the Penwood crest, and they're monogrammed at the hem with the initials SLG, Sarah Louisa Gunningworth. They also do Sophie's hair, they perfumed her after her bath, and they've rouged her lips with something that they nicked from Rosamond's collection of whatever diabolical beauty supplies existed in this century. Just once, Mrs. Gibbons said, for just one night, you will be the belle of the ball. With a smile on her face, she slowly turned Sophie around until she was facing the mirror. Sophie's breath caught. Is that me? Can we please keep "is that me"? Now, I'm not overly attached to the line, I don't think. Not more than I need to be. There are other lines that are especially iconic that I would favor more if you were to ask me which book quotes I really want to see Yerin and Luke perform, but nonetheless, "is that me" is still a cute one. Her hairstyle is described as a loose top knot with one thick lock sliding down the length of her neck. She has also got sparkling powder on her hair so that she sparkles like a fairy princess. And her mask is a demi-mask that ties in the back, so she will not have to use her hands to keep it on her face. And that sounds fairly accurate to what we've seen from the rehearsals that were photographed from the masquerade. She didn't have a loose strand of hair coming down from what I could see, but it was an updo. The dress description seems somewhat similar, although I really couldn't see the details of the dress in those photos, but she was wearing a demi-mask that ties in the back, so her hands are free. No idea about the sparkling powder though. Perhaps we will just leave that detail in the draft. Sophie's shoes are a pair of white satin slippers, stitched in silver and adorned with faux diamond rosettes. They consider trying to put her in shoes from Rosamond or Posey's collections, but neither of their feet are the right size for Sophie, which is why they end up having to take the shoes from Araminta's collection. Also, the slippers perfectly match Sophie's dress. Sophie is given instructions that the coachman that drove Araminta and the girls to the ball has now returned to Penwood Park, and he will take Sophie to the ball now, but Sophie has to leave by midnight because he needs to be back at the ball for when Araminta and the girls are going to want to leave and return home. By this point, it's a bit after 9, so Sophie will have more than 2 hours at the masquerade, which to me seems like an awfully short amount of time, but to her, it's like a dream come true because that's just the Sophie Baek way. Just full of love and gratitude in her heart. She emphatically thanks Mrs. Gibbons, who tells her to just have a good time, and that is all the thanks that she needs for what she's done. Sophie looked again at the clock. 2 hours. 2 hours that she'd have to make last a lifetime. Oh, Sophie, you have no idea your whole life is about to change. Not just change, your life is about to truly begin. So to run through the events of these 2 chapters, the main points I would make are as follows. We need to see a Sophie flashback or flashbacks to her childhood. It is fundamental to a general audience being able to understand her as a character and how it is that she navigates her relationship with Benedict. I don't think you need to do that as an opening for episode 1, but if I were to try to guess where I would start those flashbacks, either a third or midway through episode 1. Perhaps somewhere in the midst of the chapter 1 commotion of Sophie being bombarded with chores while the women are preparing for the masquerade ball, we could get our first flashback to explain that Sophie is a bastard of an earl who married Araminta. I don't find it necessary to explain everything with the terms and conditions of the will right away, but the parental lineage would be better to explain in episode 1 before Sophie goes to the masquerade where she meets Benedict. The will reading could be a flashback that plays at some point while the show is focusing on whatever is going on in the stepfamily household after Sophie has been kicked out. A lot of what goes on in chapter 1 is something I would try to do with high speed. Quick cuts, whip pans. It would be a way of conveying through the language of filmmaking how hectic and chaotic Sophie's life feels when she's being bombarded with all of these chores to do, especially in the lead up to the masquerade ball. You would also have the option to intercut that with the preparations going on in the Bridgerton household for the masquerade ball, which they are the hosts of. It really depends on whether or not you want to draw those parallels at that moment, or if you would prefer to keep the focus solely on the household that Sophie lives in and works in when we first meet the character. We're not getting into the details of the masquerade just yet because this video is already more than long enough, but the masquerade needs to happen in episode 1. I just watched 56 episodes of dramatic escapades that were more often than not thoroughly satisfying. The only thing I really hated was literally anything and everything involving Carolina, because I don't like to watch a child being put into distress the way she was putting that child into distress. But all this to say, I am in no position to tolerate nonsense storylines that I don't care about, wasting screen time in such a way that would push the masquerade further back. Season 4 is Benofi, so they need to meet in episode 1, which means Masquerade Ball in episode 1. Chapter 1 is easy to trim and condense down. The major question mark for me is how much of the prologue will be included, where will that material be placed, especially episodically speaking, and how much of it will be shared in live action versus being shared verbally. I want to hear from the audience as to your thoughts on those various questions to do with the prologue material, because for me, a fair bit of the prologue I do want to see played out in live action, but some of the information I wouldn't necessarily mind seeing verbally shared if it means it's Sophie telling Benedict about what she's been through. I'm also theoretically open to her sharing some of these details with other members of the Bridgerton family, because ultimately the number one thing I want to see for Sophie is her with Benedict, and second to that, I want to see her connecting with her new family that she doesn't know yet is going to be her family as well, because she doesn't know that her and Benedict are endgame.
It's been a long time, baby.
You don't really start to have Benedict's perspective on things until chapter 2, which is why I haven't mentioned him as much in this video. But since there is so much focus on flashbacks for this video's overall topic, I will say that I would prefer that season 4 do something to address how Benedict experienced the loss of his father and had to become the emotional caretaker of the family. How are we, as romance girlies, going to lament the ways that women are so often pushed into doing emotional labor for others without being thanked for it, just for you to not acknowledge Benedict as the Mr. Emotional Labor of the Bridgerton household?
Questions that seem to linger, no matter how far you go to escape them.
Are you quite well, brother? My valet saw you carry Miss Sharma inside. Is she all right? I didn't know. Are you all right?
Our connection is based on spiritual, not physical intimacy.
What?